and share. And presentation. Okay. I've done a version of this clinic a couple of years ago, and I found that in my computer, and I started pulling it apart and working on it because as a part of a completely different project that was going on in the NMRA, I had taken this clinic and split it into a bunch of parts and was using it as the basis for an instructional program that the NMRA was working on, and it probably still is at some point somewhere. And I've got all of the slides and all of that stuff all separated out. But I wanted to pull components of that back into one smaller presentation as a clinic for someplace here. And since Walt needed a clinic and I was working on that, I thought this is a good chance to put it on. Parts of the components for this version of the clinic are brought about by my desire to continue working towards my MMR. And I've got 5 of the 7 certificates. Author will be next at some point. And then the last one was probably going to be cars, except that at Charlie Mason's thought I should do motive power, because all I have to do is scratch build one locomotive. And there's a manufacturer out that produces 1/35th scale railroad locomotives from Belgium from about 1937. And that would be a really interesting something to build in 187 scale, take the 1/35th scale parts, draw my own plans for those in 187 scale, and scratch build myself a 187 scale shunter, which would be kind of fun. But anyway, parts of what would go into any kind of modeling project includes things like scratch building brake gear. And that's some of the stuff that I've included here. And I've been changing through some of my painting and working and other stuff going on in my military modeling, working on changing how I paint and weather stuff, and that was reflected here as well. So a bit of a background for some of this. My railroad is a large transporter of military equipment. I'm building a military installation on the railroad, so we have stuff to transport, but we need cars to transport that equipment around. And there is a basis for that in the real world. The Department of Defense has decided that they need at least 1,500 89-foot flat cars to meet their needs for transporting equipment. And the fleet in service keeps dropping below that minimum need. There was a new order that was started for new cars that was going to go into production, and that would have brought the minimum need up above 1,500, but then it would start back down again, and by 2027, the flat car pool would drop below the minimum need of 1,500 cars yet again. And that's a problem because, of course, as we all know, the military needs to transport stuff all around. Okay, great. So they've decided that they will produce these new cars. And there's some comparison of the various 60 and 89-foot flat cars that are in use across North America, mostly owned by TTX. And how those are in use is presented here. They have the ITTX cars that are 70-ton cars. They have TTDX cars that are 70-ton cars. And then the new fleet of TPDX cars that are either 70 or 100-ton cars with chain tie downs and bridge plates between the cars. And it's interesting to see all of this stuff online. And all of this stuff I just pulled off of online presentations related to DoD cars. And this doesn't even cover the heavy-duty cars that the DoD owns themselves for transporting very heavy armored equipment. These are all 89-foot cars that can get used anywhere, as is presented in the next slide. But these new 100-ton, 89-foot flat cars have a gross weight of 286,000 pounds. They have pop-up container fittings so that you can plug containers down onto them if you need to. They use the standard bridge plates that TTX maintains for that sort of thing. And there's even an interesting online video on using the bridge plates and the pins that go in to hold them in place. It's all of that stuff you can find online as well. The new chat flat cars are compatible with all the other XTTX flat car fleet. And these cars will ship out and keep with them 40 universal chain sets. And the sets of chains that go on these cars just stay with them wherever they go. They just get pinned down to the cars and off they go, which is kind of interesting. And this is how these cars are used in the real world. The 89-foot flat cars are used as shown here, and then the 60-foot flat cars are as shown there. But the overall concept is that these cars are needed, these cars are in use, and there's a shortage of them. So my thought was, how do I address this, at least in the modeling environment? And so this is what I came up with, and this was the basis for the original clinic. This is what we will do to address the need, at least in my version of the world, since I model today and I proto-freelance what I do. So for the first one of these kits that I built, I came up with this concept of what to do with these cars after a tour that we took of the Trinity Rail plant in Cartersville for the first Tracks the Max convention. It was a very interesting tour. They featured some parts about tank cars. They had rapid discharge hoppers that were under construction. But one of the things that caught my eye and kind of sponsored my interest in this for this clinic was there was an 89-foot flat car on the shop floor that they were cutting the racks off of, and you could see the cut marks in the racks that had been welded to the deck of the car, and they were just slicing them off with a torch and then grinding what was left down. The cars obviously last a lot longer than the racks themselves, so they were just slicing the racks off. And my thought was, we could do that here. If I ran across a collection of auto racks that were no longer in use, we could just slice the racks off and use those to build or rebuild cars for use for transporting military equipment. So I took one of these AccuRail double deck auto rack kits, and using the components in here, the rack components, I thought, well, all I have to do is stick those in the slots in the side of the car and let the glue dry, cut those off, grind them, file them down, and off we go. Really nice idea that didn't work very practically, because in order to get those uprights to stay, I had to build the rest of the car. I had to put in the deck and all of that other nifty stuff, and I had to put in a fair amount of glue to get them to stay, and I built it, and I cut it off, and to me, that was a bit of a waste of time. It worked and it looked good, as you can see, but it seemed to me it was just too much work. And you'll see examples of it if you come up and look at the cars here. You can see what I did in each of the succeeding methods, because in the first car I built the rack, cut the rack off, filed things down, filled in holes because there were still holes in the floor where the rack little pins didn't cover everything. And no. So the second car that I built, I used Tamiya plastic putty and just filled in the holes and sanded them down and patch painted over them. That worked a lot better. And as you can see, as you'll see later, what I did on the next one. So on the third car, and I started with an unweathered kit here, I changed method of filling the holes. On the first two cars, I used Tamiya plastic putty, the white stuff that comes in like a toothpaste tube, and it worked really well. It sanded very smoothly and all that stuff. But I found this stuff from Mr. Hobby at one of our local train stores, and that is nice stuff. It's kind of a semi-liquid material, and I just painted it into the slots on the roof, on the deck of the car. And you can see in the holes here, that's all it is. It's just this sort of semi-liquid plastic putty painted in, and it settled into the slots in the car very neatly. It did not require much sanding. It made a very smooth surface without a lot of work. It's not quite the same effect that I was after by building the racks and just slicing them off and sanding a little bit, but I think the process was a lot neater. So that's what it looked like. I discovered probably partway through the first round of these that or at least in one of the kits, that the sheet metal weights that are in these cars are really kind of, well, they're bare sheet metal and they do rust. So I discovered sanding them and priming them was a really nice idea. So that was something that I did for this third kit as I started working on it. Once all of that was sanded and cleaned up and painted and all that stuff, I attached the sheet metal weight to the underside of the car. And because the plan was to rebuild the brake system to explore working towards MMR and the car builder certificate to do brake gear, I also filled in all of the holes with the same semi-liquid styrene filler that you can see right at the top of the frame. Those are those three holes that were in the sheet metal weight to allow you to glue the brake gear parts directly into slots in the underside of the deck of the car. And I wasn't going to follow those, so I filled those in as well with the same semi-plastic glue, or the same semi-plastic styrene stuff. And I like that, and it worked, and that part worked really well. It just took a little bit of sanding. And then, like I did, and I showed in the first version of this clinic I did some time ago, I then used I don't remember who does the kit, but it's a nice kit that has 256 tap and die sets in it, a tap and die set in it. So I drilled pilot holes and tapped the bolsters and the sections for the coupler boxes for 256 screws, so I could screw the trucks and couplers in place, not use the pins that AccuRail supplies with these kits, because pinning with glue a truck in place doesn't allow for much in the way of maintenance at some point. So that doesn't work. So tapping the bolsters for a screw made a lot more sense. And that's what you see here. I used screws versus pins to mount the trucks. And I also used I also use screws in the coupler boxes so I could mount the screws or mount the couplers with screws. Makes maintenance a lot easier. And as is standard for me, I ended up using KD couplers. You could use either. I like the whisker couplers. It's a lot easier to use those than it is with the phosphor bonds bent coupler pocket springs that you can get with KD couplers. They work fine. I just like the whisker couplers. And you could use either the standard size or the scale size. Either one works fine. I think I have a bunch of the bulk packs of the 140s with the standard size coupler. So I just use those because that's what's handy and that's what I use. And then I stick to Intermountain wheel sets. I like Intermountain wheel sets. They're machined metal wheel sets. They do a really nice job of it, of constructing their wheel sets. And their wheel sets are heavy, so it adds weight down as low as you can get it, track level, when you're working away. So I like Intermountain wheel sets, and that's what I try to use for everything that goes on my railroad. So that's just what's there. Then I started in on the process of doing additional detailing. The first thing that I did, and I did this on the second car and continued on the third car, and I'll do it for all the rest of the cars I do in this collection, is I cut off the built-in stirrup steps that were there because they're just molded in. You just use a chisel blade and slice them off neatly. And I like these Tichy Train Group stirrup steps. And so that's what I've started using on these cars, and they look good, and they're finer detailed than the cast-on stirrup steps that came with the cars themselves. So I slice those off, and off they went. They are plastic, so you CA them in place. And I constructed my own jig for using against the side of the car to drill holes into the side of the car, because the stirrup steps themselves have little pins on the back, and if you can line those up and put them in neat holes, then that also helps to hold them in place. So I used this little styrene jig to drill the holes in the side of the cars at the appropriate place. And then the next thing I added to the ends of the cars, because they look good and they're kind of noticeable, are the uncoupling levers. These ones from Plano are very nicely detailed, very small pliers to bend them into the appropriate shape, but you cut them off of their fret with a very sharp blade, and you get these little pieces that look like this that you then bend into shape to form the brackets, which is entertaining, fun to do. And it's something that you see more and more in other hobbies, and it's bleeding into HO scale. I suspect you can probably find the same sort of thing in N scale. I don't model in N scale, but I suspect there is not. Okay, well, there is some in HO scale, and you can certainly find it in 1/35th scale. And this is where I started experimenting with it, and now it's bleeding into my hobby here. So you bend these things up appropriately with a very small pair of very flat pliers, and they get attached to the end of the car along with grab irons that you bend yourself and put into the appropriate size holes. And then I started to work, and this was the main reason why I went after this, is because the underside of a car needs its brake gear detailed. And for any kind of a project that you're going to work towards master model railroader, working in the cars certificate, you need to, you don't have to, you don't have to purchase, you don't have to make your own brake fittings, but you do need to do all of your own brake plumbing. And that was my main goal here. So I bought a commercial brake kit for just the brake fittings and did all of the plumbing myself. And the Car Builder Cyclopedia, which I've got a copy of, or the underside of an Athearn Genesis 89-foot flat car, or the instructions in the brake gear kit all discuss the plumbing that's necessary. So as you start construction on that, you arrange where you want to put the parts. And the reason why I filled in the holes that were in the under the side of the car is because I wasn't using the car's brake gear. I was using the brake gear from this kit. And it all goes in a different location. So you start plotting out where it goes, drilling holes, bending wire, and plumbing your brake gear. And that's what this ends up looking like here. And it's an interesting process. I kind of enjoyed it. It may not be for everybody, but I kind of think it was a fun process. Took a while, but it was okay. But I started with the plumbing. I'm not sure exactly why. It just seemed to make sense. And then I did the brake rigging itself with the clevises and the brake lines running out to the trucks and all that stuff. That's the part that made the most sense to me after looking at it. And that part I enjoyed. Something that you will notice in this photograph, along with all of the brake rigging that I did, you'll notice that there were, and this was been in earlier pictures before, you'll notice the holes that were in the center of the center sill on this car. Why there were holes in pins through from the car floor, I have no clue, because there were no screws to attach the center sill to the car. There were just holes and pins, and I filled those in. And I filled them in, did what I thought was a reasonable job, but you'll see in a little bit that no, and I continued working with it to improve it. As I continue to progress in other forms of modeling, like in my 1/35th scale modeling, priming to me has reached an increased level of importance, making sure that you have everything smooth, everything nice and neat, all of your construction work looking good. Primer helps, because if something isn't smooth or isn't neat, it will pop out with primer, big bump on the road. So I've discovered that priming, at least for me, is a good way to know that, yeah, I've done a good job of cleaning this up and making things look neat. Prime the top of the car, great. I'm sort of after the effect of we cut all of the upper structure for the racks off. So if there's a little bit of unevenness along the side sill of the car, that's okay. But if you look at the underside of the car, where those pins and holes were, I discovered, no, I didn't quite get that as smooth as I thought I should. So you can see the effects of sanding or resanding over the center sill of the car to get to the point where everything was as smooth as it could be. Increasingly finer grits of wet dry sandpaper to get to the point where the underside of the side sill of the car looked like nice, neat steel. And I've discovered that in my other modeling hobbies, priming and pre-shading, the concept of making sections of a of a piece of equipment darker and grimier before you actually apply paint is a really good idea. Especially for in this case, the underside of the car, where things are kind of dark and grungy anyway. So after priming the underside of the car, I then pulled out in this case, a can of black spray paint and lightly highlighted the underside of the car. Since I built this car, I've been experimenting with pre-shading in 1/35th scale armor with the airbrush and with an appropriate compressor, and that you can dial the air pressure down low enough and you can spray a fine enough pattern with a single action or dual action airbrush. You can do pre-shading around individual fittings and in individual gaps or panel lines. And you can end up with some really cool effects. And I didn't quite get to that point with this, but it still highlights or lowlights the underside of the car. And I like the effect because once it's painted, as you'll see in a moment, on the upper part of the car, it's already possible to add some grime and some shading and some gunkiness to the upper part of the car by pre-shading, especially things like, if I were to do this again, down the center sills, down the chain guides, because the chain guides themselves are recessed, therefore they are darker, and because they would normally have chains living in them all the time, they'd be really gunky. You know, the cars themselves don't need to be completely filthy, like, you know, a coal hopper or a grain car that's been running around for 30 years, but the chain guides would still be messy. So that's what this is simulating. So once the car is all complete, you and pre-shaded, seal the car with a semi-gloss finish, and I started in decals. My railroad has custom decals for the Utah, Colorado, Western and number jumbled, so that part works fine. Pull those out. And then I found a decal set for microscale for the stenciling for everything else for the car. I think this was actually from a set for 89-foot, the dual cars coupled together. But the stenciling all works from other microscale decals, the COTS lettering, other stuff from other places, all combined together. And then the last part of the lettering part is reflective striping. I found either online or maybe somewhere in Model Railroader at one point, a company, Smokebox Graphics. And Smokebox Graphics produces reflective safety striping that is reflective. So you can take one of these cars with these stripes and shine a flashlight on it, or, you know, whatever it is that you've got handy to produce light, and it reflects, and they're really kind of cool. They're self-adhesive. My suspicion is that in HO scale, they're probably 2 or 3 inches thick, which is about the only out of scale portion of it. And on the side of a box car or a hopper car, that's not so bad. On the side of a flat car, it's a little bit off, but the effect is really awesome. And they produce them in 3 different colors. I liked this one, at least for this car, and they look good. And whether you apply them nice, neat, and straight and level and all that stuff like it came out of the factory, or like you see if you're looking at cars in the real world that have gone into the shop to be, you know, redone or had new striping put on them because of excess graffiti, if you model that, and you put the new stripes on or replacement stripes on slightly at an angle, because the average car worker just pulls off the strap and just goes and sticks it on the car, and there it is. And if it's lopsided, he doesn't care, she doesn't care, that off it goes. The requirement is that they're there, not that they're neat and straight. So you can simulate either one of them, and they are self-adhesive, and off you go. So once the car is complete and you've done a semi-gloss or a flat finish over it, and I've now come to the conclusion that after decaling, you put a semi-gloss finish on it because that makes washes easier. But anyway, you end up with a car that looks something like this. Now, as a tribute to Joe Sullivan sitting way over there, I have now split my weathering into two completely separate components. I have a wet component, which are all washes of some form or another. And then I have a dry component, which is almost exclusively still pan pastels. I like pan pastels. They work really well. You can build pan pastels up in layers, but for certain functions, wet weathering to me makes perfect sense, makes better sense. And on this car, this is what I used. I used fuel stains, I used grime, and I used panel liners. And we start with the wet layer. And one of the first places I put a wet layer is a layer of grime that I just flow over truck side frames and just let it dry. The nice thing about it is that it pools into the low areas on the truck side frames, settles into there, dries there, and leaves a layer of grime. And that's what you're after. And it does a really nice job of it. And it does a better job of it than I could do with pan pastels. Now, you'll see in a moment that pan pastels over this work really, really well. But the initial layer of gunk and grime that settles into truck side frames is awesome with a wash of some form or another. And it doesn't have to be a grime color, but pick something. I also have found that in certain circumstances, like brake gear under the underside of a car, or in a covered hopper, any hopper, under the slope sheets where the brake gear is, working some kind of a pan pastel sponge up into there can be a challenge. But you can get a small brush and apply a wet weathering layer to the brake gear on a car without destroying any parts of the slope sheets on a hopper car or the brake gear up underneath a tank car or brake gear underneath a flat car or anything else for that matter with a layer of grime that comes from a wash. And that builds up the layer of grime on the underside of the car really easily without having to worry about destroying your brake gear. Then the dry part starts in. And like I would do for almost any car, a variety of different colors of dry pan pastels, kind of a grimy color, this gray color, and a couple of different layers of rust color. And all of those built up on layers on top of a pre-shaded car, you end up with something that really looks pretty good. And as I said a moment ago, the first thing I did for the cars was to build an underlying layer of grime with a wash, but then the upper layer on top of that, first kind of a lighter layer of dust effect from pan pastels, which highlights the upper parts of the truck side frame that you can see. It also means that the truck side frame itself doesn't disappear underneath the car, so it looks like the car body, in lower lighting conditions anyway, isn't hovering above the rail without any trucks underneath it at all. So if you weather the truck and then put kind of a highlight layer over it, the truck itself stands out a little bit better, like they would in a 1-to-1 scale car. After that, I can then apply rust to it because, of course, wheel sets on cars, truck side frames on cars, and couplers on cars are all unpainted bare steel. Therefore, they do rust. So the springs, parts of the side frames, all those different things are all, to one degree or another, at least somewhat rusty. So you can apply different layers, different concentrations, some heavier, some lighter, it doesn't matter. And since trucks do get swapped out, you could have cars that have one truck that is more heavily rusted than another. And then I went to work with dry weathering on the top side of the car. And of course, the car itself, like I noted earlier, was pre-shaded. So there's already kind of a gunkier, grimier appearance to the top of the car. And then you can add a couple of layers of, or more than a couple of layers. It depends on how in tune with weathering layers you want to be, of a couple of grimier, darker layers, and you end up with a car, once it's all done, that you can see the truck side frames from underneath the car, even in relatively moderate lighting. You can see the brake gear of the car because it's highlighted and weathered, and you didn't have to worry about destroying it with pan pastels or a heavier brush, because you can just use the brush from, lightweight paintbrush with washes of some variety or another. So you end up with that. And then the deck of the car, which is clearly visible, at least until it's buried in military equipment, is nicely weathered and easily viewable. So once you're all done, these cars can then go into service on the railroad, which is what we need in the first place because we're running low on them. And so they end up in service out on the railroad. In this case, with the first generation and the second generation of cars that I built in this series, sitting at the training center on my railroad, and a different view of them with the equipment that serves that facility. And it's sitting on the railroad now. And so at the open house, if you come by on Sunday, you'll see it. And the final picture of it with all three of the cars sitting together on the railroad in use. And the second two are just waiting for their equipment to get strapped down to it. And Shadow says, come and see us on Sunday. Questions from the outside world? I don't. They're Black & Vetter wheel sets. I have done it before, but I tend not to. And I don't really know why. It just doesn't seem like it brings much benefit to me. I have a jig to paint them in, and I could do it, but I just don't. Yes. Yes, that's exactly what it is, and thank you for mentioning it because I forgot to say that. Yeah, I wanted to fill those in as well, and I discovered no, that's clearance for the wheel sets. Maybe if we use scale wheels with scale flanges, maybe. Yes. Ooh, I could rust those up really severely and throw them in the back of a gondola. That's a good idea because they're just sitting in boxes now. Yes. All I know is that it's Mr. Hobby filler, and it's in a little plastic jar or little glass jar that's about that big around. Yes. Okay. It's in Japanese. The label itself is in Japanese, and I don't read Japanese. I read Korean, but not Japanese. Oh, yeah. It's styrene. It's just dissolved styrene. I mean, you could do the same thing by dissolving styrene in Tamiya extra thin cement, and it would work very much the same. It's just this is a lot easier to do. But it's styrene, and you can sand it with a sanding stick or sandpaper or a file or whatever you want to use. Yes. Yeah. That's what Howard was saying from across the room because I think I got it at Hobbytown, but it's the dissolved putty. Yeah, that's it. And you can paint it on. I just use one of those disposable brushes, so a little micro brush, because you buy a little plastic container of those, like 24 of them, and so you can use those with dissolved putty, with dissolved putty. Yes. Time just well, since I primed the car with metal slash plastic primer, I haven't had an issue with it. That because the whole car in this instance, yeah, it's the paint's still there, so it's been fine. I just primed it with, I primed the car with Tamiya surface primer. There's also a surface primer by Mr. Hobby, and I understand it's good. I just couldn't get it at the time. Yeah, yeah. That's what, yes, it is what they call it. They have like Mr. Prime, they have Mr. Surfacer, they have Mr. Hobby, they have Mr. Scissors, I think, and Mr. Knife, and it, huh? Yeah, but that's a rock group. But they have they have a whole string of products, and they're really kind of nice. And I like their primer, and I've used their primer before, and I like it, and I really like the putty that they have. Anything else? Walt.
Cords. Thank you very much, Perry. Fantastic presentation. So, Jim, I want to make sure I said this tonight. The Georgia Northwestern Model Railroad Club had a change of date for their meeting, which is going to be, I want to make sure I get this right, the 27th. So it's Thursday, the 27th. So not to be in a conflict with the SCR convention. Howard will be their clinician that night up there in Cartersville. So just a little note of change in case you were planning to go there. I want to say thank you for everybody coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad you're here, and please invite other model railroaders and friends to come to the meetings and events. And like I said, we have an open house this weekend, and pay attention to the website as well anytime we have changes and things and updates. Also, I want to remind you, if you have any personal items with you, it's not raining tonight, but I do have a nice collection of umbrellas. But please make sure you take your personal items with you. If there's any trash, if you'll please dispose of it before you leave. And that'll save them having to clean up the room and stuff. We try to leave it the way we found it. So I appreciate y'all coming tonight. Everybody have a safe night home. Hope to see many of y'all at the SCR convention. And if not, hope to see you at Perry's house on Sunday. And if not, then we'll see you here next month. So everybody have a wonderful weekend. See you. See you guys.